Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Makone Maja. Makone, how are you doing?
Trying to keep up with the gloomy weather. Otherwise, I'm all right. How about you guys?
I'm pretty good, actually. It's quite lovely and sunny in Cape Town. Not that that's good for me, but most people like the sunny weather. Me, I prefer the gloomy weather. And we're also joined today by Anlu Keeve. Anlu, how are you doing?
I'm actually enjoying the sunny weather. Thank you very much. I'm doing well.
Indeed. And it's good to have you both with us today. Right. It is Friday. We'll try to not be too super depressing. I've realized that sometimes the show can be a bit of a downer, but let's get into it now by talking about our Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, who was in Parliament defending the Expropriation Act, which was signed into law by President Ramaphosa quite recently. He said the Expropriation Act is, it's actually a pretty good thing because it'll allow us to speed up land reform, but it's not going to be too excessive. He said that while the Expropriation Act would assist in ensuring land restitution and redress and all these things, that it did not mean that white farmers' land would be grabbed, and that the Act allowed for expropriation only within the parameters of the Constitution. He was responding to an EFF question in Parliament about the dismal pace of many of the government's land reform projects, many of which have taken a very, very long time to be completed. I think there's 5,600 claims dating back to 1998 that need to be settled, but they are at maximum only managing around 300 a year. So it's going to be quite a while till they get through that backlog. And that's assuming the government doesn't decide to create new instances for applications for land restitution. Mashatile said that one of the main constraints, however, is, the implication of saying that the Expropriation Act is going to fix the problem here is that, no, you see, the farmers are all just being difficult and the landowners are being difficult, and that's why we need to, expropriate the land away from them for no compensation. He says here the main constraint is, in fact, insufficient budget, and that they need significantly more funding in order to drive this stuff forward. He said, quote, I know that when the president signed this act into law, there are those who are saying, oh no, now we have land grab from, white farmers and other people who have had land before. What we're doing with the Expropriation Act really is to ensure redress, to ensure that those who were previously denied and the land was taken away from them do have access to land in a legal manner. So there's no way you can have the law and that law allows you to grab land just haphazardly. A MP from the UDM and also from the DA pointed out that at least 800 farms that have been redistributed through this program have gone fallow, are not being worked anymore, often due to, and this is another issue the Deputy President raised, infighting in the communities who get the land. Often when this land is given to a group or to a person, it's not like a single person, it's not even like a single family, it's usually like the community of X, and that often creates a big problem because you have this like body set up, this community organization set up, and there's huge fighting over who gets to run that, or sometimes the person who's running it runs off with the money made from the land or steals the money that the government has given to build it up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Makone, what's your take on this? I mean, the president here is kind of both saying the Expropriation Act will fix the problem, but also that it's like not a big deal, like don't worry about it.
I sometimes struggle to discern whether the ANC is being deliberately misleading about the act, because these are fairly high actors within the ANC and within our state, like the Deputy President. The President himself has made similar assertions about the Expropriation Act being an instrument of land reform and helping to correct the rights of the past and to redress all those land reform related concepts. Or if they just do not understand the Expropriation Act and have not actually taken time to understand it. Because this has led to, I know the international confusion about what the Expropriation Act is for is what has garnered most of the attention, including of South Africans. But I think domestically, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Expropriation Act is. And even through the Deputy President's rhetoric, it's almost, he's explicitly saying that this is an act that's going to assist us with redistributing land and clearing up the backlog of restitution claims. That's not what the Expropriation Act is for. I mean, sure, land reform is intimated by the words public interest being included in the definition of expropriation, so that an expropriation authority can expropriate provided it's in public interest or public purpose. But it is dangerously misleading to many impressionable South Africans who have been without land, without title for decades, to continue peddling this narrative that the Expropriation Act is going to address failures of land reform. It's not. In fact, I was part of a panel yesterday for this media company called the DW, the 77% Show. And we were joined by young, emerging, I'm talking early 20s, emerging farmers who are all expressing hope at the prospect of the Expropriation Act finally getting them a door into farming. And that's because of the continued peddling by the ANC and fashioning of this act as a means of redress. It's not. This is just simply a way of the government being able to acquire land, because you have to remember that when you think of land reform and specifically restitution, there has to be a relationship between the parties on behalf of whom the state would be acting to return land, right? So person A took land from person B, and now the government is stepping in to reverse that. I would argue that market value compensation should be accompanied with that, just to protect our financial institutions and to protect the integrity of rule of law, of which property rights are indelibly attached to. I don't think that we should have the mindset of expropriation or land reform forsaking everything else. I think there are much greater and broader harms that could be experienced by the country at large if we think of expropriation or land reform that narrowly, but that there's a relationship between the two parties. And yet when you look at the Expropriation Act, it's clear there is none, right? Like who the Expropriation Act targets, specifically the EWC clause, the expropriation without compensation clause, which includes people who have lost control over their property and have not exercised reasonable means to restore that control over their property, or even people who hold land just to appreciate from its value and are not really making use of that land. If the government takes land from me, let's say I've bought a piece of land somewhere in the east side of Joburg and I'm just hoping it appreciates in value so I can sell it and make a quick buck, and that land is expropriated and it's given to a community so that they can live on it. There's no relationship, there's no causal relationship between me and those people that you can argue that's restitution. And yet there is this continued narrative by the ANC to, I think, mostly impressionable South Africans that this is a land reform project. And also they speak about the backlog of restitution claims. What about title deed claims? The Ministry of Human Settlements released statistics last year, November, saying there's 1 million title deeds that they hoped to clear the backlog of between the years 2019 and 2023. And of those millions, some of them predate 1994. Most of them accumulated between 94 and 2014, and then they've been more since, and even like about 300,000 new ones since 2014. Yes, sure. When you look at the backlog of restitution claims, it's much smaller. But what about that of title deeds, where it's actually households potentially living in homes? It's not tracts and tracts of farms that people can go and farm on and make a good living on. These are individual households being kept out of homes because of government failures. And my last point is this, Nick, that a high panel of experts that was assembled and commissioned by Parliament to identify where land reform was derailed came back and said that it wasn't the costs associated with land reform that was the problem, which the Expropriation Act, as Deputy President argues, is meant to address. It could primarily be brought down to three things. The first one is inadequate state support post restitution. Yes, you can give people the land back, but is it going to be accompanied by support in water and electricity, actually having the skills to farm, or are you just going to give them the land and walk away? In which case, you're like the DA and UDM MP argued, you're making them vulnerable to just having land that lays fallow for years after, land that's just wasting away. The second issue that they mentioned was the backlog of title, because immediately you eliminate that backlog of 1 million, then you have more than 800,000 households having access to homes that they can use as security and assist to accumulate wealth. And the third was the issue of corruption. They broke it down into two. One is the funneling of state resources to the elites, and the other is just downright misuse of state funds. So again, this idea that the Expropriation Act is going to assist with land reform is objectively not true. Even the high panel of experts said so. The Expropriation Act in and of itself, it does not address any of our land reform struggles. And also it's not constitutional. Expropriation without compensation is not constitutional, even though Deputy President argues that it helps to align with the Constitution, unlike the Act of 1975. Objectively false. But yeah, it's just so misleading to the many South Africans who are hoping that, this is going to be their lifeline. They're finally going to be able to live. And those who are waiting for restitution claims to be settled, waiting that this can finally be resolved.
No, well, you've given so many rich topics to dive into there. I'm actually sort of almost at a loss of which direction to go in. I will say that Anlu, one of the things that I agree completely with Makone, that the land reform part of this is actually largely misdirection. This is about weakening property rights in general. And, there are reasons listed in the bill for nil compensation, but the thing that bears repeating, or not the bill, the act, sorry. But what bears repeating is that it's an open-ended list. So they say, it's for people who are speculating. But, actually kind of any reason we think of that aligns with public interest, which is so vague that actually it means that it's sort of open season on reasons for expropriating with no compensation. But leaving that aside, one of the things that frustrates me so much about the land reform discussion here is this idea of is like almost conflating the promise of title deeds with what actually happens in these land reform programs. There's always this you see there were people who were denied buying land. One of the great crimes of apartheid and the segregation laws that came before apartheid was that black people were not allowed to own certain types of property. It's a great crime against the people of this country. But then the government solution to this is, okay, but then as a cooperative community, you must sort of jointly own it, but you don't really own it because us at the government, we can stop you from selling it if we don't want you to sell it. And you have to manage it through this trust that's almost always going to end up being a source of division in the community and fighting over, who actually controls the usage or that sort of thing. And it's most cynically expressed through the EFF's policy, which essentially, as far as I can work out, is the number of black landowners will reduce to zero because the state will own all the land. So it's just a false promise. It's promising to empower black South Africans, but the reality is it's saying, actually, no, the state is the only one who's getting empowered here. And I think that's the bottom line about the expropriation bill. Your thoughts on any and all of this, Anlu?
I think Makone worded it very articulately. And I think you're exactly right in the sense that it's almost a mantra that they keep repeating. You keep hearing the words of, it's like they run through the story of land was stolen and we need to give it back, and it's the people and the people and the people. And what they do is they kind of include somewhere in there, but we'll do it fast. And that was quite prominent in this piece. We want to speed it up. We want to get it into gear. And look, doing things fast means you're going to have to do it twice. And in this case, they just never actually get to doing it. I think land reform is exactly an example of where they're trying to do it fast and they're just getting absolutely nowhere. And what we hear is specifically now from the deputy minister is that is that the only constraint here, in his words, is it's money, and it really isn't. The real problem is management of it. The economy is stuck in a low gear. So yeah, there's money that they kind of push or point to it. But the problem is that they can, at this stage, an example of it is they can only process 300 claims a year. They're like absolutely getting nowhere. So there's absolutely no management capacity. And I really liked what Makone said with, okay, but now the land changes hands. I'll get to who the hand is that now receives the land. I'll get to that now. But so the land changes hands essentially. But now what happens? What's next? Like there's no training, there's no tools, there's no business plan. They just like give you a handshake and they're like, okay, good luck to you. And that's
me and some colleagues from the IRR have over the years been to these cooperative farms, and sometimes they there's all these promises, like you say, of training or whatever, but then 3 years down the line, it's all evaporated into dust, and you find a lot of people sitting around very sad, empty buildings with no money and no ability to change stuff around.
Yeah, I think Makone, she said it's impressionable people, and I think it's exactly that. They're setting up impressionable people to fail. And it's almost as if the whole process is upside down in the sense that we're transferring land, but before we build the skills to actually manage the land. So yeah, it's because they're not interested in you owning the land. It's because they're interested in a quick way to acquire land. That's the whole issue. So if the focus was on the people, then actually supporting them to benefit from the reform, that's exactly the irony we're trying to point out here, is that land reform, in the sense, it needs investment, but not money necessarily. It needs that as well, but it needs commercial partners. It needs capital, but mentorship as well. And if you don't get that, or you definitely don't get that by threatening property rights, because I mean, who's going to want to actually invest these things? Not only capital, as I said, also non-capital expenditures, which is incredibly important. Who's going to actually want to invest time if there is a risk of, taking the property again and anyway? And then every single time I'm on the Daily Friend and we talk about this topic, immediately afterwards, I feel so bad for myself having forgotten to say this. So I want to say this time in very clear terms. Thank you, Makone, for the reminder. But the government is not wanting to give the people the land. They want to keep it. It's exactly them who you'll never actually own the land, but they kind of want to. I can only explain this in Afrikaans. They want to take a vet kans from impressionable people to get their land. So yeah, the whole process is just mismanaged and missequenced, and yeah, in extraordinary sense.
Final thoughts, Makone?
As you're both speaking, I couldn't help but think, who benefits from all of the scapegoating? It's the money. No, it's not the money. This time it's people don't want to give up the land, and that's why we need to take it through coercive means, and expropriation without compensation is coercion. Who benefits from all the confusion? Exploiting vulnerable people who, yes, the claims of restitution have had their land taken from them and are desperate to get that land back and have been trying to for decades. You would have recently seen the Protea village community in the Western Cape be given their land back after their claim was successful in 1995 already. And only today are they finally able to come together. The people who have chosen not to get the money, but to actually continue farming, come together, collaborate with the state and with a private sector. I'm actually optimistic about that model because they've gotten the private sector involved. So I hope it works out for them. But who benefits from, the constant invoking and appealing to people's who are most desperate need for access to land, access to financial security, which a deed would provide you with? It's them. It's the government. Because the Expropriation Act is not going to assist with redress, right? So 10 years from now, they have to say, we have to double down. Now we have to amend the Constitution because the Expropriation Act didn't work. No, it wasn't going to work to begin with, because it's not an instrument of land reform, and they put the cart before the horse, because first the Constitution has to make expropriation lawful, expropriation without compensation lawful, which it currently doesn't. Then you can pass an expropriation without compensation clause. Then, as Deputy President Paul Mashatile said, you can make the argument that it's in line with the Constitution. At present, it's not. But it's them who benefit from all the misconception, because at the end, they get to say, we tried everything. It's the people who have the land who are refusing to give it up, or we tried everything. It's the people who have given the land who failed to exercise good control over it. And as one of the people in the comments said, Gina Shepherd, if you're cynical, you may be inclined to think, well, maybe they're setting people up to fail deliberately. I'm not there yet, but I can see where this is going. I think we can all see, at least when I'll go on next slide.
Even if that's not the deliberate plan, it may end up being the result of these failed projects over and over again. Yes, no, exactly. The entire structure of this, of weakening, it's so often we see it from proponents of the National Democratic Revolution sort of suite of policies, is you implement a policy, it causes damage, you say the only reason that there's damage is because we didn't do it hard enough. You see it with property rights and land reform and weakening those. You see it with taxation, you see it with centralization. Almost everything NDR proponents suggest is on this line. It's like, oh, it failed, we need to do it harder. See, same thing with BE, happens all the time. The reason it hasn't uplifted millions of Black South Africans from poverty is because we didn't do it hard enough. Which, as we see time and time again, is actually the opposite of how things work. All right, let's move on, because we've gone quite long on this one, to the much talked about, bandied about 100 billion rand BEE transformation fund. This is government's grand new idea of how to raise big pots of money to transform the society by taking money from private companies and pouring it into a centrally controlled government pot, which in no way will be misspent or stolen, like all the other pots of government money that we have. Anyway, Parks Tau, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, put out a sort of proposal about how this fund is going to work. And he's been stressing very aggressively, no, it's not going to be coercive. This isn't a tax. We're not saying to business, pay more into this fund on top of what you're already paying. No, we just want business to take the money they're already giving to, various social upliftment projects as part of getting BEE points, and instead give it to the government. Because we know how to spend it better than you. And in fact, they even claim in the proposal that private companies are desperate to spend this money on social upliftment, but they just don't know how to. Don't worry, we'll do it for you. I guess part of this could be seen maybe in a positive light, which is that there's an implication here, although it's not explicitly said, I think, that it's kind of almost a bribe to big business. It's saying, you give to our fund, and then we give you BEE points. Now, in some ways, that's actually better than the way that BEE kind of currently works, if you allow business a way to kind of go around it. But let's be honest, the potential for the abuse of that is phenomenally catastrophically huge. And as we've seen from other big pots of government money, the chance of this actually reaching the people who it's supposed to benefit, that being poor communities, people who don't have skills, people who are locked out of the economy, is very low. Makone, your thoughts?
So once big business contributes to this fund and their BEE points goes up, how are SMEs going to be able to compete with those companies to then get government contracts? In a way, it's self-defeating to the mission of trying to improve and grow SMEs. I would agree with somebody like Mrs. Mavuso from, I think it's BLSA, who said skills transfer is the most important thing that SMEs need, because you can throw all the money, the bottomless pit of money at them, but if they don't have access to markets, if they don't know how to commercialize, if they don't know how to improve the quality of their project, if they don't know how to maneuver the ecosystem of business, no amount of money is going to solve that, unless you're obviously bribing certain people. And I think this fund misses the point. I think that a lot of businesses want to assist with things like skills development. And I think it would have been a better way for the minister to go through that route, to say companies should contribute more to their skills levy fund, and perhaps that will get them tax cuts, or not BEE points. I'd like to stay as far away from BEE points as possible. But I think there are better ways of equipping SMEs than first taking the money through the government and then somehow hoping that that exact amount of money that went to the state, once it's done with its entire administration, that's going to help facilitate this fund, there'll be enough for the SMEs after all of that.
Yeah.
No.
I'm just thinking that, there are definitely some NGOs out there in the country that, like, I don't know, Anglo-American or someone has helped fund for years to develop skills in a community. And those NGOs right now should be feeling very uncomfortable, because unless you have some sort of political connection, that's probably the end of your funding.
Exactly.
Anlu,
Exactly. Yeah.
your thoughts? You're muted, Anlu.
Excuse me. Yeah, I just think for a country with as high unemployment and as low growth as we have, we are incredibly good at coming up with horrible ideas to actually or at least finding new ideas to restrict ways to create new jobs. We are clearly not desperate enough, or way too desperate. I don't know where the line is and what means crossing it. But yeah, so Makone explained the fund in principle very well. So perhaps I can just focus a bit on, in practical terms, what the fund will actually, what the implications of it are, or whether it will actually even work in the first place. So just it's unrealistic. Let's start there. Firstly, in just how much money they want to actually get in the fund. So it's 100 billion rand. And what they say is that one of the main funding sources would be contributions from the equity equivalent investment program. Now, we recently did research on that, and there is absolutely no way that, so I think it's something like 25% of profit that they need to invest in empowering disadvantaged people. Or projects. So we saw, for example, if I can, I don't know if I should, but I can just as well, but let's just say that we've seen some of these projects and there's very little success, right? It really is hard to see that they will actually work. And then there's also the second source of funding will come from the enterprise and supplier development contribution. So that's something like 2% of profit, and 2% or 1% from depending on what type of organization you are. So there is absolutely no way that even if corporates decide to take their money and give it to the government, that they'll get to 100 billion rand. I don't see how that is possible. And I think we need to keep in mind that whether corporates decide to give their money to government now means that, well, it depends on whether they think the government will be able to do a better job. And there's very little confidence that they can actually. They lack both the track record and the credibility to actually encourage government or encourage corporates to give them their money. But okay, let's say they do. Somehow we give them the benefit of the doubt, not that we have any reason to, but let's say they do get the 100 billion rand. Who will now manage the fund? Who does the allocations and what happens to it? So according to the minister, it will be the National Empowerment Fund that will manage it. They don't have the skills, they don't have the experience or the expertise, and they don't have the capacity to actually manage that size of a fund. And this is, I want to just remind you, this is the same National Empowerment Fund that previously said that the main obstacle to Black firms are the fact that there's limited knowledge of industry and a lack of bankable business plans. And this, I say this because we just spoke about them shaking your hand and saying, okay, good luck. So even if money comes down to SMEs, again, it's not only financial support that they need. They need support in the form of mentoring, for example. It's very, very important. And SMEs have a very high failure rate, and they are in incredible need for that extra extensive support.
Even in healthy economies, SMEs are a difficult thing to get going.
100%. Nicholas, I have one last point.
Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
I'll be very quick because I know I spoke a lot on it. But I had like let's call it WTH moment when I read this, and it said that they'll be the fund that distinguishes themselves from other funds by investing where other people don't want to go. The moment an investor, if I give them my money and I tell them, okay, you do that, I would be the dumbest investor on this planet. There's absolutely no way that is, they can just say that with a straight face and think it's a bankable idea. Anyway, I had to put that in there. Thank you.
No, it's like all the bad business ideas line up. We've got funding for you. Makone, final thoughts, and I think we'll call it to a close then.
The idea of the EEIP being voluntary also requires some debunking. And I think in some ways the concept note has added to the confusion rather than alleviated it, because there's so many things that are just not clear. And I think what Anlu was saying, that the 25% of a multinational's value operations in South Africa is measured against their BEE ownership. This is why we can't have nice things, as you always say, Nick. Starlink, right? If EEIP was voluntary, then we would have Starlink. So there are options, there are routes that you can operate in South Africa as a multinational. But to present them as optional, no, that's because there are multiple options that these multinationals have to weigh up to choose which BEE route fits their business model best. And obviously most of them are just not comfortable with giving away the 25% share of their operations to that BEE partner, although I'm aware that some of them do. And the reason I say is I raised the point of discomfort is because this was raised by the EU in a report that they did about BEE and how it hinders operations. And in that report too, they emphasized the issue of skills transfer, and that if emphasis was placed there, then you'd see BEE actually work the way that it's supposed to, because you'd be giving people skills rather than just a lottery ticket to becoming rich overnight by providing overly priced electricity, overly priced stationery to a remote school in the Eastern Cape. That's always my go-to example. but yeah, the Transformation Fund is it's cool. I think the concept notice caused quite a lot of confusion, and the minister still floating around the idea. I think he's still trying to work it out, but if he is listening, I would say focus on skills transfer. A mentor can take you places way further than 100 billion rand fund could, especially one that's administered by the government.
100%. The overriding theme of so many of the stories this week has been the government's desperate attempts to pour water into the Sahara Desert. In terms of money, just throw more money at it. That'll fix it. No, we have a spending problem in South Africa. We don't have a collection problem. We don't have government is not poor. It spends its money terribly.
Indeed.
And that's overwhelmingly an issue all over the place. But anyway, we don't have time for our third story. But I hope you found the show interesting. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you all next week on the Daily Friends Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.